In this video, we're going to look at the role of formative assessment in student learning and how you can use formative assessment in your planning decisions to inform future instruction that best meets student needs. So the first question we ask is, why assess in the first place? Assessment has a very bad reputation, and most people immediately assume there's a negative connotation tied to assessment. We're going to see that formative assessment plays a really vital role in the process of student learning, and that the bad reputation it has is because it's often been misconstrued and used by forces and groups that aren't interested in actual student learning, and they're using assessment data for other purposes. So this deviates from the original intentions of assessment and how we're going to think about assessment in our class. So designing formative assessments can help us to answer the question, how will we know where students are in their learning or development? And this is really important because if you don't know where they are, how do you know that your planning and the lessons that you're teaching are going to support them? There could be a big gap in what you're assuming students know that they actually might not know. So it's important that we use formative assessment data in order to help us better see where students are so we can help them move forward. So the assessments provide evidence of student learning, and we're going to use that phrase rather than data. Data also has kind of a bad reputation, but really what it is it is evidence of what students know and can do. Finally, we use that evidence to guide our planning decisions. Sometimes in popular media we hear about student data being used to rank teachers or say how effective a teacher is. Again, these are uses that we are not considering. We are using evidence on a daily basis to help us better tailor what we're doing in the classroom to all of our different student experiences. So one definition that might help to frame this is from Diane Sweeney's book, and she uses student evidence as a way to help instructional coaches help teachers improve their practice. And so she uses the phrase student evidence or data and explains that it includes any information that helps us understand where the students are in their learning. It may include writing assignments, student notes, verbal statements, or anything else we see or hear students doing. Student evidence can be collected through informal or formal assessments, conferences, observations, or just plain talking with kids. So when we think about assessments, they aren't going to be these high stakes, timed, 100 multiple choice question tests. That's not what we're talking about. It could be students are working in a group and you're listening to the conversations they're having. It could be a student writing conference where students telling you about the choices they're making in their writing draft. So it's much more informal. It's a part of what's already happening in your classroom, which is very different than this kind of more formal, very, very structured testing environment that we might picture when we hear the word assessment. So two terms you're going to hear frequently are summative and formative assessment, and these both have a role in your classroom. The common view of summative assessment is that it is an assessment of learning, which means the learning has already happened and it's at the conclusion of that process that you're going to say, hey, what do you know now? What have you learned over the past week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks? It can be imposed from a school district or state level as a form of standardized test. So this might be, if you're in middle school, it could be a final exam. It could be one of the standardized tests that you're required to give your students by the state that you're teaching in. They can also be your own projects. It could be a book project where you have students presenting on the book that they read. That is also a summative assessment. So this one tends to be anywhere from locally controlled to more controlled at a global level. Formative assessment, on the other hand, is assessment for learning. This means that it happens throughout the learning process. Pretty much on a daily basis, you will have some form of student evidence that you're looking at to tell you what you're going to do tomorrow. It's locally designed, it's controlled by teachers. The big difference here, again, is that distinction between assessment of learning at the end or assessment for learning, which takes place throughout. Summative assessments, like we said, can be within or outside of a teacher's individual decision making. In either case, though, there can be concerns regarding how timely and appropriate the evidence can be in supporting students in individual ways and at a variety of times when support is needed. Timely and appropriate means that formative assessment, for example, you're doing on a daily basis, so you use the evidence to change what you do tomorrow. Summative assessment, on the other hand, if you're not doing that till the end of the unit or the end of the week, you can't necessarily make changes that will help students when they need help. So really, summative assessment isn't used to change your instruction because the information you get will be at such a later date that you can't necessarily go back and help students just in time. And that's a phrase you'll hear a lot too. Just in time means you realize what they need when they need it, and you can help them in those ways. One big kind of complaint that people have and that you may see in your classrooms is that a lot of teachers have an over-reliance on summative assessment. So they don't necessarily know where their students are at until they give the test. Well, then it's kind of too late to help students. So we're going to encourage you to use multiple forms and means of formative assessment on an ongoing basis that will allow you to craft more just-in-time instruction. So by the time you get to the summative assessment, you should already know where all your students are at and if you'll be able to get to your goal because you've really been working closely with them throughout the process. So for formative assessment to truly work, it needs to be an integral part of your everyday classroom. The first point by Black and Williams is that teaching and learning must be interactive. We're not going to plan the whole year's lesson plans and teach them just as we have them planned. We may have an idea of where we're going, and that's part of that backwards design model. But what we actually do every day is based on what our students are learning and what their needs still are. So you're always going to be adjusting if you're designing responsive instruction, because what you teach is based on what students have learned and what you're hoping they're going to learn at the end. The use of evidence generated through assessment is central to this definition of formative assessment. And here's that the key verb is use of evidence. To be labeled formative, the evidence from the assessment must actually be used to modify teaching to meet students' needs. I've also seen situations in classrooms where pre-service teachers or even their CTs are using formative assessment. They design one, it's good, they get the feedback, they look at it, and then they still teach the lesson exactly how they had it planned originally. They're not actually using the evidence to change what they're doing. It's either confirming or telling them, hey, they really didn't get as far as we thought. Oh, well, then it's not really formative assessment. It really should be used to change what you're doing tomorrow. Maybe you have to revisit a concept, or maybe half the class has it and half the class doesn't. So now instead of doing a whole group thing, you need to just kind of re-envision it and instead do some small groups because not everyone is ready to move on. It's really important that you are designing assessments that will give you the information you need and that you actually use that information. We don't want to be robots that are just giving the same instruction no matter where our students are. We also want to tie formative assessment to feedback. The information teachers get from formative assessments must not only be used to make changes in teaching, but also must be used to help students understand how they can improve their own learning. This relates to self-directed learning and students taking ownership of their own learning processes. So we'll be talking a bit about feedback, especially in terms of writing, but it's important that we give feedback either in written form or just through talking with our students to help them understand where they're at and where they can go. So let's look at some characteristics of formative assessment. And this is all going to be taken from the NCTE statement that is on the web page, You can look through this as we go through this if you already have it downloaded, or you can revisit these when you're reading through the article after this video. NCTE states that teacher-created classroom assessments designed to inform instruction are much more likely to function as real requests for information that can change instruction and improve learning. Many summative assessments, because of the external imposition and distance from in the moment or just-in-time decision-making, serve as a means of control of teachers, students, and curriculum. Formative assessment is a constantly occurring process, a verb, a series of events in action, not a single tool or a static noun. I love that last statement there, because we're thinking about formative assessment as active, as something that's happening every day as a natural part of our classroom, not as something separate that someone is making us do to students. It is what students are already doing, and that's a really important distinction. The policy statement also gives some characteristics that you can look to in order to see how the formative assessment you're being asked to use or that you're designing, how that's going to help you to understand student evidence in relation to learning targets. Here's that key kind of word you see over and over. It's goal-oriented. So when we go back to backwards design, we have our end goal that we're hoping to get towards, and all the formative assessments along the way are helping students and us as teachers to know where our students are at in terms of reaching that goal. And then we provide differential instruction based on where they're at in order to help them get to the end goal. So key themes here are that it's goal-oriented, there's opportunities for students to improve their performance, and that they have specific criteria they're looking at as they take ownership of the process themselves. A couple ways we can look at formative assessment are as observation, and this would be field notes on your computer, in journals, or on sticky notes, running records and miscue analysis, which takes place during oral readings and retellings, or it could be a checklist and observation guide where you're marking tallies or notes on a chart when you're looking for specific evidence. This is really powerful for both having students talk about what they read, but for speaking and listening skills as well. You might just be listening into a small group talking through something, and you'll be observing for specific things that are relative to the day's goals. Another form of formative assessment is conversation. Surveys gather information about preferences, attitudes, and experiences to design future instruction assessments. Interviews are where you're going to sit one-on-one or with a small group of students to get some deeper insights into what they understand and what they think through more open-ended questions. And we will be spending time on writing conferences in our class, but you can also have reading conferences where you're focusing on how students explain the process and the product and their understandings about the reading and writing process. Self-evaluation can come in the form of exit slips, and this could be where you ask students to, explain what they understand and maybe give us something they don't understand. Just write down today at the end of the day, what did you learn? What are you still wondering? And that's a very clear way for you to know, did I reach my goals? Where am I going to go tomorrow based on what students are wondering still? Using rubrics and checklists is helpful for you as a teacher, but it's not just about that summative piece where you give them a grade. Helping students to use those to kind of chart their own progress is a helpful way to work towards that self-ownership. Process reflections are kind of more where they're reflecting on their progress in relation to learning targets throughout a unit or a project. They're able to both understand where they want to be and to kind of reflect on where they're at right now. And then there's also student-led conferences where they're kind of more focused on their own goals and using that to generate future interests in the classroom. And then finally, you have artifacts of learning. And this is just collecting student work in any form that you're going to analyze for patterns. It could be reviewing the observations and your other samples, or looking at a learner's progress over time and across evidence. It's really important because, especially when we talk about English language learners, for example, if all of our formative assessments require students to write and they're all in the same format, we're kind of saying you have to have these writing skills in order to tell us what you know. However, we could have students talking with us, they could be talking. We could have them talking with peers in a small group. There's a lot of different ways we could gather information about what they know. So it's important that we are intentional about designing multiple ways to gather information so we get a really full and clear picture of where our students are at and we aren't limiting it to one form of evidence.